Hi, welcome to this episode. This episode is about my childhood. So, I'm going to describe to you my birth, and then before that, how my parents got married and what happened to the marriage, and then how I grew up, my early high school days, and like mostly I'll try to cover through my high school in this episode. First of all, I have to start my childhood story with my parents. My father has had no schooling. He was literally an illiterate. He could not read, he could not write. I guess later on he did learn how to write. And he was just working as a laborer and as a mill worker. The What I know about him, the little that I know about him, he was a laborer, a mill worker. He was a textile mill worker. Apparently, he had learned that trade of running they call it the weaving looms. They call it looms, the electric looms, which mostly was a legacy of the British. So that's what I know of him. My mother, on the other hand, my grandfather was a school teacher, especially in English and French. So my mother grew up in probably a convent education, English medium education, and she had graduated her high school. And they always used to say those days high school was equivalent to today's graduate degrees. That's how much knowledge they had, especially about the language, English. And she had gone to work in the army, Indian army, when it was still, India was under British rule. So she could converse equally on par with the British officers. She worked as a stenographer, so she was not a soldier, but she was part of the army. And I don't know whether she joined her army after the marriage or before, but as a stenographer, she was working before marriage and had given my grandfather, that's her father, all the money that she had made for a few years. And as a gratitude for that, later on, he gave her a small property. So, the coming back to my story, my mother was a dark-skinned lady, but very well speaking in English and things. She was so dark that she could pass off as a black woman. And when it was time for her to get married, it was all arranged marriage those days. It was difficult to get a proposal, a boy for my mother. So somehow through relatives, as it happened those days in our circle of families, marriage proposals are usually done through relatives by telling people relatives and friends. So I had one call it Masi or we call it Periyamma. That is elder to my own mother, and she had brought in a proposal of my father. And apparently, my mother, the only question she had asked was, is he educated? Uh, and of course, they told her, yeah, he's educated and all that stuff. And I don't think there was any conversation beyond that. And those days, the boy and the girl didn't even see each other before their marriage. And the elders spoke among themselves, and either they couldn't afford or what, they didn't want a big wedding. So they decided to have the wedding in a pilgrimage town called Velanganni, which is very famous for the Christians. And in fact, people of all faiths, Hindus, Muslims, everybody go there in the millions. It's become a very famous pilgrimage spot, where incidentally later on I built my first resort. And the wedding was scheduled in that church, the Velanganni church. And then the wedding mass, we were Catholics. So the wedding mass happened. And in our families, even though it's a Christian wedding in the church, the boy ties the Mangal Sutra around the neck of the bride. And that's how marriages are done. And there was no exchanging of rings and things like that, like in the Western culture. So the marriage took place, and in the end, the churches have a register of marriages, and in that, the boy and the girl have to sign that they were married, and that is accepted as legal proof of marriage. You didn't have to go to any government office, organization to register your marriage. This registration in the church at the end of the ceremony, where the boy and girl signs, and then of course there are always witnesses, that is taken. So apparently my mother went and she signed her name. She was very good at being an English trained person. And then when the register was turned towards my father said he could not sign and wanted a pad for the thumb impression. Imagine what my mom would have gone through at that moment. She was such a English trained person who could speak with the British officers on equal terms in English, and getting married to a man who was an illiterate, not educated, could not even sign his name. So the story goes that my mom started crying, and after they came out of the church, announced she's walking out of the marriage. Such things were unheard of in those days. It was probably the late 40s. And of course the marriage broke. My father's side went their own way. They came from a town called Tirupur, which is near Coimbatore, a large town in Tamil Nadu state. And my mother and her family came back to Madras, and I think maybe that after that is when my mother decided to go join the army. Maybe she wanted to get away from everything. And so it apparently went on for a few years. My paternal grandmother waited for a couple of years or something, sending word to my maternal grandmother's mother and family that hey, you guys better resolve this. They are married, and I want my son to live with his wife and have children. And of course, my mother refused, and my grandparents couldn't do anything about it. So my paternal grandmother announced, if that's the case, I'm going to get my son married to somebody else. So she went to an orphanage, which is run by the Christians, and found a girl who originated from Kerala. So we call them Malayalis. Got her married. She was pretty, fair in color, and of course she was an orphan. So my grandmother got my father married to that lady, and they started living together, living in the house. I don't know what kind of marriage it was, because my father and mother were legally married, so there was no divorce. So it was probably not a church wedding. And they had, my father was working in a local mill, and they had 3 children. One girl and 2 boys. Today all of them are doing very well. The eldest daughter, the eldest half-sister, was a school principal or something. My elder half-brother was educated as an attorney and worked with a big corporation. And now they are all retired. And my youngest elder brother was half-brother. James, his name is James. The first sister's name was Regina. The second brother was Raj. And my other brother was James. He became a school teacher and then he retired as a headmaster. So this went on probably, I think, 5-6 years. And my father's meager income could not support the family. My father had a sister, we used to call her Rajaman, and she apparently kind of sacrificed her life and worked. She was a school teacher, and she brought up 3 children, and my stepmom, my dad, my grandmother. She supported the whole family with her income as a school teacher, and my father's meager income as a laborer, mill worker. And things were apparently becoming hard and hard. So I don't know how it finally happened, but finally the relatives all around, that's a family support is huge in India. They all got together and decided that my mom, who was the legal wife of my father, was doing very well working for the British Army and earning quite handsomely. She was giving all the money to my grandfather. And they somehow convinced my mom that she should start living with my father, for that she was the legal wife, and then that family is in such disarray and poverty. They didn't have apparently enough to even eat 2 meals a day, and my mom's salary could help those kids. So the end result was my mother went to Bombay, and she got a job as a customs officer but again in customs, the Bombay customs, as a stenographer. And my father moved to Bombay, and he worked in a mill in Dadar. Dadar. I told you in the previous episode, I grew up in a town called Goregaon, which was about, I remember about maybe 5, 6 train stations in the local metro train. And they started living together in that Chotrani Chawl. And my mother was giving the money, sending the money to this other family. And then, of course, I was born. So apparently before me, I had an elder brother who was born in Chennai. My mother had come to the mother's house for the delivery. And he was born in the hospital. I think the hospital was called Gosha Hospital. It's right across from Marina Beach in Chennai, Madras at that time. And he was a big baby, and the doctors had to use, we call it forceps, like tongs. They hold the head with the tongs and pull the baby out. And a lot of accidents happened because of that. And my elder brother, whom I've never seen, died within 2 days of being born. So when my mom was pregnant with me and she had gone to the mother's house, she refused to go to the hospital because of what had happened to the first child. And then, of course, I was born in my grandfather's upstairs where his room was. It was the open terrace covered with a thatched shed. So that is where I was born, under the thatched roof. I told you already I was named Ignatius because I was born on that day of Feast of Saint Ignatius. One of my earliest memories about that floor, the thatched floor, was my grandfather and grandmother used to drink some kind of liquor, homemade moonshine or whatever, and they used to make it themselves. So there was a corner, and they had this big ceramic container in which they would put all the fruits and this and that and mash them up and cover it with a cloth, and every day they would go and churn it, and finally whenever they feel like drinking, it was probably like a beer or something, but all I could remember was it used to stink like crazy. As a child, that's what we used. But we used to go there and put a glass inside that ceramic container, and then take a glass and drink it. So that was called the Moola Pana. Moola means the corner, Moolai, and Pana is the container, the ceramic container. So they say, okay, my grandmom will tell my grandpa, why don't you have your Moola Pana? I'll bring the dinner for you. And my grandfather had a habit, he would never go down. He would go to church in the morning, and then he would come upstairs, and I think that was his quarters until the next morning. He had his bath there. There were no showers or running water. They brought him a bucket of water from downstairs, and he would have his bath and stay there. He and my grandmom used to smoke a pipe. It was a black pipe. It was called Sungan. And they used to do. And my grandfather was very short, and he was a school teacher, English and French. And his name was Andoni Muttu. So they put the caste name Chettiya, Andoni Muttu. But his nickname was Kulla Vadiyar. Kulla means short, Vadiyar means teacher. So that is what he was known as, Kulla Vadiyar. His name was Andoni Muttu. Kulla Vadiyar Andoni Muttu. And he had to eat fish every day. So evening dinner time, my grandma would shout from downstairs, "Dinner is ready." So he would ask, "What is there for dinner?" And if my grandmother replied anything, anything other than fish for dinner, he would say, "No, I'm not hungry. My stomach feels bloated." In Tamil, the word was vairu uppusama irukku. Uppusam means bloated. So that's the earliest thing I could remember about my grandparents.